What's up, guys? This is Kayla Bundy, and you're listening to the Finding Hope podcast. Happy Wednesday. I'm so glad you're joining this sisterhood, this community, this place of growth, and the idea that we are rooted in hope for something better and hope for something more. And in each episode, I'm going to give you some actionable steps to get to where we can live in the fullness that I believe God created us to live in. This week's episode is a topic I am so passionate about, and I've been wanting to talk on it for a long time, but I didn't feel qualified, if I'm being honest. And I really have been wanting to do a lot of research, understand it more myself, do a big deep dive, and kind of outsource lots of information on this topic. And I honestly kind of feel like one episode is nowhere near enough to cover all the aspects. So who knows? Maybe I'll do a little series with this and we'll dive into certain aspects of it. But today's topic is all about boundaries. And maybe if I do a series, I'll do like boundaries in relationships or in friendships or in family dynamics or in mental health. I don't know, because I feel like this topic is just so broad and there's so many different sections, but I'm so excited to do a true deep dive into boundaries from a biblical standpoint and at least have you guys walking away from this episode feeling a lot more knowledgeable and knowing how to implement boundaries, implement boundaries, and knowing what the desire should be when you are establishing boundaries and when you're accepting boundaries from others. I'm going to shout out a podcast episode that really was so helpful for me in establishing boundaries. I listened to it probably a year and a half ago at this point, if not 2 years ago. And it was from the Whoa, That's Good podcast. And the episode was called, Are You in Denial About the Red Flags in Your Relationship? She had Lisa on, a guest. I'll link that episode in this podcast description because I think that was such a breakthrough moment for me. I learned so much from that episode, and I'm going to be drawing a lot of what we're talking about today from being inspired from it. For me personally, I didn't really understand the idea of boundaries. It was never a topic that was spoken of or addressed. And when it was, it felt like it was always done in a really petty way. And when I started having friends implement boundaries or people in my life talk about boundaries, I just didn't get it, and it felt really selfish. And what I had been used to hearing and being taught in the church is to lay down your life for someone, and true love and having good, deep relationships is carrying each other's burdens, and you do that together, and we mimic Christ's love in the way he loved us. And so that was always sort of my guiding light when it came to romantic relationships, friendships, family dynamics was, well, what's yours is mine, because I'm your sister, I'm your friend, I'm your girlfriend. Of course, I'm going to carry this and I'm going to fully take this on as if it's my own. And that was kind of how I lived my entire life. So needless to say, your girl really needed boundaries, because that truly can only get you so far without being extremely destructive in yourself, in your relationships, in life, in certain dynamics. I learned that not quickly, unfortunately. I wish I could say, it was so quick. I learned that changed everything. Absolutely not. I think I finally started implementing boundaries and knew what boundaries were when I was 22. So it took me about 22 years. It took me about a solid 22 years. And we're still learning, we're still growing, but we've got more experience under our belt now. So when I actually dove into, well, what are boundaries? Why do we need boundaries? What makes them helpful? Is it selfish? Is it not? Is it biblical? Is it not? How do we mimic Jesus's love and have boundaries? And truly, what was the biggest breakthrough point for me when it came to actually wanting to include them in my life, because even if I understood them, I was like, well, I don't necessarily see the benefit in including that in my life. But what really switched for me was when I learned that from the moment in creation, in Genesis, the first book in the Bible, all over Genesis, it is boundaries on boundaries on boundaries. Every single thing God created had a specific purpose and a specific separation of what it was going to do and how far it could go. And just in creating day and night, there was a boundary there of when the sun would come up and when the sun would go down. In the ocean, there's a boundary line so that our whole planet isn't covered in water, but there are these boundaries everywhere. If you look in the Bible, it is absolutely covered in boundaries, and boundaries in knowing God's role in our life, boundaries in knowing our role as a son or a daughter. There's so many boundaries all throughout the Bible. And Jesus, when he was here, he walked in a way where he definitely established boundaries. He established his alone time. He established when he would be with people. He had boundaries onto who he would be with. He put boundaries on the people that had the most amount of access to him. And even when it came down to laying his life down for us, it was not done to enable our sin and to let us continue, but by him self-sacrificing, it was so that we could have forgiveness. We could have an eternity with him, not so that we could continuously go on in sin and not having a repentant heart at all. So the first thing I want to make so clear is that boundaries are so biblical, and they were God's creation, and they started in creation. Genesis 2:16-17 says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, 'You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die.'" I think this is a beautiful example of setting that boundary of protection, and a boundary out of love, and not out of a lack of freedom, but rather to actually operate in a way where it feels free. The goal should always be to expand and never take away. And what I mean by that is, I think there is so much more freedom you can have when you have boundaries. And in my personal experience, when I had a boyfriend set boundaries on me, a reason I was never a big fan of boundaries is because it was out of a place to control. There wasn't a desire for me to walk in freedom. There was a desire to control me so they felt okay. And that, I think, was also a big turnoff for me when it came to even learning about boundaries, because I felt like, oh, well, it's just a way for you to control things so you feel happy and you have this perfect little world that never gets messed up. And that's just not true. That was so a lie from the enemy. Boundaries should always be coming from a place, just like God demonstrates in the Garden of Eden, where you're actually loving them more and you're creating this protection where they feel safe, they feel free, and the relationship between you two grows deeper. And I think a beautiful just depiction of this is if you have a yard and let's say there's kids, okay, and there's no fence in the yard and anyone can just come in. You can have murderers, you can have thieves, you can have anyone, because nothing is keeping the bad out and nothing's keeping the good in. It's just a free-for-all. And so with that, the kid's going to go out with a lot of fear because they don't know what's safe, what's unsafe. They don't know what's okay, what's not okay. They don't feel protected. And the parent is going to be worried 24/7 because they have no idea what harm could come to that child. And then if you place a fence, you build a huge fence, you build a massive fence, and there's all of these toys in that fence that the kids can play with. When the kids go out, now it's different because you've built something where you're keeping the bad out and you're keeping the good in. And so now, instead of the kids not knowing when they can go out, where they could go, what they could do, it's crystal clear the boundary lines, and they have so much freedom to explore whatever they want within those confines. And when the bad comes, it's easy to recognize it and to say, okay, great. Well, that's not a part of me. That's outside of me. And I can leave that there. I don't need to let that come in. And it gives the parents way more trust, knowing, oh, because of these things, I don't have to watch them like a hawk. I don't have to keep my eye on them like crazy. I can let them have fun. I can let them experience things, knowing they're safe and knowing they're okay. And the goal is that fence gets bigger and bigger and more toys get added. Not it gets smaller and smaller and more things get taken away. And so when I kind of understood, oh, that's what boundaries are, it's actually where we can operate in a way that I feel free, where you feel free, where we don't have to be living in a place of fear of not knowing what's on the other side. That is exactly how the devil deceived Eve, was getting her to be fearful of, well, why wouldn't you want to know more? And why would God hide this from you? And so I think the second we're operating and establishing boundaries out of a place of fear, it's never good. It should always be coming from love and how you can love them better, how you can love yourself better. And by creating that freedom in the sense of when you have clear boundaries and you're able to grow from that and expand that, then it truly does create a sense of freedom, because without boundaries, it feels controlling. And when boundaries are coming from a place of fear, it is controlling and it's not healthy, and that's not biblical. Whereas when boundaries are coming from a place of love, you can exist and operate in the way God designed it. I think boundaries also just help maintain healthy relationships without resentment. I know when I've been in relationships where I feel like boundaries are coming from a place of control, or there's no boundaries whatsoever, I get resentful. And when I have not established those boundaries in my life of, hey, I'm okay with this, I'm not okay with that, I feel like my voice isn't being heard, even though I'm not even using it. And even if I might say something, if I don't have a follow through of actually setting those boundaries, it's so easy to get upset at that person when you didn't take on that responsibility of creating these boundaries for yourself. People will totally walk all over you, and not in a mean way, not in a way that they're trying to take advantage of you, but when you give, people like to take. And sometimes it is, they have horrible intentions and it's totally their fault, but sometimes it's no fault of their own. There have been countless times where I would offer up my time. I would offer up my help. I would offer up so much of myself when I actually didn't have that to even give. And then when people would come into that and would take advantage of that and would use my word and say, yeah, well, you said you would help. And I would get so resentful, because I was like, oh, I don't have this capacity. I can't do that. But I said I would. And I would get myself in all of this just self-turmoil, and I would self-sacrifice to a point where it destroyed me. And I never would take it out on them. I would just take it out on myself. And so I would notice I slowly became a way worse version of the person God created me to be. And it was due to a lack of boundaries. And that's a big reason I'm so passionate about this whole topic, is because when I was not operating from a place of love and from a place of understanding how to form boundaries and knowing they're healthy, knowing that they're God's design, I lost myself. And in the podcast that I referenced at the start of this episode, she had a really good exercise where she wrote down the best qualities about herself. When she's at her absolute best, what does that look like? And when she's at her absolute worst, what does that look like? And for me, when I was at my best in certain ways, I was super empathetic. I was super understanding. I had so much patience. I had such a generous heart. I was so upbeat. I felt so filled up, and I could pour out so easily. And when I wasn't at my best, I would get easily irritated. My patience was so thin. I was exhausted. I was on defense mode like crazy. I did not feel generous with my time, with my resources, with anything. I felt really taken advantage of. When I would look at the difference, a lot of what caused me to be not the greatest version of myself was almost always due to a lack of boundaries. When I had not established healthy boundaries in my relationships, and I mean that in every sense, family, romantic, friendships, but I had not established boundaries in my relationships, it would sometimes get me to that point. And not in every relationship. I mean, some relationships I was totally fine. I felt like I didn't need any boundaries and I had the greatest relationships. And others, then I would experience this horrible version of myself. And so you definitely have to identify what relationships need what sort of boundaries. That I also had to learn. When I realized, oh my goodness, so much of this is really truly coming from a lack of boundaries. And it's leading me to feel all these horrible emotions and to think these horrible things and to have this impatience and exhaustion when it comes to people. I had to really do some work. It takes two to tango and it takes two to find restoration. And if not both parties or the three people or the whole family unit is not wanting to grow and wanting to heal and wanting to repair and get better, and there's only one person, you can't make anyone else do that. And so it's really given me a lot of insight as well as to where I spend my time, who I spend my time with, what that looks like, and making sure I'm the best version of myself for everyone around me. Because when I was in those times in my life where I had a lack of boundaries or my boundaries were not being accepted, they were being completely dismissed, it made me a way worse version to everyone around me, because it wasn't that my patience was thin with them. It was that my patience was thin with everyone. It wasn't that I wasn't bursting with joy with them. I wasn't bursting with joy with anyone. And I started becoming way more judgmental and really living in a place of such fear. That is where I don't want us to continue to operate if you've been there, or to prevent that from happening if you have not experienced that. So when it comes to deciding kind of what boundaries need to be set and maybe who they need to be set with, this is where I love just bringing it back to Jesus and looking at the way he lived his life. And we all know he had 12 disciples. They had very different roles in his life. And there was about 3 that he was very close to. And he gave a little bit more access to himself. And I think that's so cool, because not everyone in Jesus's life had the same boundaries on them and had the same access to him. And it's cool to see sort of the responsibility that comes with the level of access they were granted. Jesus is fully God, yet fully human. And it could have been so easy for him to just come into this world, let everyone know every single thing about him, and not have any relational boundaries whatsoever, because he's God and he doesn't need to let that affect him. He doesn't need to have his alone time. He doesn't need to not operate in a human way. He could have operated completely in a God way. And I think it's so cool how he truly operated in the flesh, because he was flesh and blood and he was human, and he had human capacity and human limitations, and he didn't ignore that and he didn't deny that. His strength solely came from the Father and solely came from God, but he still relied on the Lord to supply him, and he relied on the Lord to give him discernment. And I think it's so cool how he had different boundaries for different people, and how he even set boundaries in his alone time with the Lord, and making that a priority and making a distinction between his disciples and the people who were just following him, and making distinctions between his close friends and his disciples versus all 12. And I think it's something to take note of, because if Jesus had boundaries in his friendships, I think we should have boundaries in our friendships and our relationships. And even in the church, and when he talks about how he's washing the disciples' feet and he's saying, you know, the greatest of these should become the least of these, he's giving clear guidance into when you have greater access to things, it requires a lot more humility and it requires a lot more responsibility. And I think when we have more access to people's hearts and we have a little bit more access to their lives, it truly does require on our part a lot more understanding, a lot more responsibility, and it's a different level of stewarding that friendship, because it's easy to steward a friendship when you don't know that person super well, when they're not coming to you crying to you about the deepest things that they're dealing with. It's easy to steward those friendships well because they don't really require a lot from you. But when you have deep relationships and they're coming to you with hard things and they're really struggling and they're really hurting, that level of access that they're giving you, it's easy to see that it's delicate. And if a friend's coming to you crying, you're not just going to slap them in the face and say, pull it together. No, you can see there's a delicacy that needs to be handled with this. And I think the more access we give to people and the more access we're given, there's way more of a responsibility of how do I actually steward this and maintain this well? And how do I reflect the Father's love in these moments and with these relationships? And Jesus was so incredible at balancing that and protecting that and knowing who could have that intimate access to him and what disciples and what friends and what people he let himself be vulnerable with, because I don't think it's wise to do that with everyone. I definitely am not a big proponent of just letting every single person have access to you in the same ways. And when it comes to boundaries, it looks different for each person. I think the boundaries I have with my family are going to look different for every family member. The boundaries I have with my friends are going to look different for every friend. And that's good. That's okay. And I also think too, the goal of boundaries isn't to create all of these rules and regulations at all. To let those boundary lines continue to get smaller and smaller. And it comes with growth. I'm such a big fan of a slow burn when it comes to any sort of a relationship. I think a slow burn is so beautiful because instead of starting with no boundary lines and then bringing them into place, you're starting with a bunch of healthy boundaries and you're slowly able to take down those walls and to take down those fences. And you end up having this huge courtyard that you guys can run around in together instead of starting that way and then all of a sudden feeling like, I need to be boxed in because now I'm hurt, now I'm this. In my last relationship, I definitely was not the best at that. I fully had no boundaries when it came to my emotional health and well-being. And it became a lot harder and took so much more work trying to get to a healthy place because it didn't start at a healthy place. And I think when you can start at a healthy place and then let that place grow, it's just so much more aligned with God's design. And side note on that, even with his disciples, he talked so much in parables and stories. And eventually, as time went on, he would say, I can say this to you plainly now. Or I'm saying these things to you in parables because you're not going to understand it if I were to tell you what's actually going on. And so even with the disciples, it was kind of a slow build. He wasn't like, okay, great, you're following me. You have all access to me. He was slowly letting that relationship develop where there was being trust built, where there was being love built and developed and grow, and where it could be more of an open dynamic in communication. It did not start as a fully transparent, open communication. I want to touch on the misconception of dying to yourself, because I know for me, that was what held me back in a lot of ways when it came to boundaries, was the idea of laying down your life for one another and self-sacrifice. And I've really experienced a lot of people that I love and respect and look up to dearly that would give me the advice of, well, that's what it looks like to lay down your life. That's what it looks like to sacrifice. That's what it looks like to truly love your brothers and sisters in Christ, or that's how we're called to live. And that was really hard for me. I felt like by me saying no to things, or by me not just forgiving and forgetting and moving on and letting myself continuously get abused in ways, I mentally, I felt like I was disobeying what God wanted me to do. And that was just such a lie. And I really want to press into that, because you should never be letting yourself get walked all over when you're feeling like, oh, well, I need to carry my brothers and sisters' burdens. I need to self-sacrifice. That's what we're called to do. We're called to lay down one another's lives for each other. I really want to stress that, yes, but never when you're enabling them. And that blew my mind. When I distinguished and learned there's a difference of I'm self-sacrificing in a way that's helpful versus I'm self-sacrificing in a way where I'm still getting harmed and they're just being enabled and they're continuing to do this. And sometimes it can be as simple as someone's venting to you and they continuously vent to you and nothing ever changes. It's the same problems. And learning, okay, I need to establish a boundary there of, hey, you can vent to me, but we have to have some steps that we take. And if things aren't changing, I can't keep hearing this, because this is really going to weigh on me. And this isn't a burden I can carry because nothing is changing. And that's a good boundary to set. But then there's a difference of, hey, okay, somebody's venting to you and they're constantly seeking therapy. They're constantly seeking growth. They're constantly having tough conversations. They're constantly getting themselves out of these situations. Then you're just encouraging them on that. You're not carrying that burden. You're able to encourage, and it's a lot easier to operate and not have these strict boundaries when there's growth on the other end of it. Jesus did not lay his life down so that we could continuously live in sin. He did not lay his life down and sacrifice himself on the cross so that we could continue to parade around in our sin. No. And when it comes to us self-sacrificing, it is not loving to self-sacrifice in a way that continuously enables that behavior and continuously harms us. When you feel like you've reached that capacity, it's exhausting for you. It's taking away from you. It's making you that worst version of yourself. That's a really good sign that I'm actually not self-sacrificing and laying my life down in a way that mimics Jesus's love. I'm actually enabling them. And this was just so hard for me to walk out and to wrap my head around and to truly believe. And I think it's because I spent so long and so many years and had so many important people in my life really press into love is self-sacrifice. And it's not. And it is not meant to be done in a way that continues to let others get harmed, never change, and never grow from that. I want to touch on titles as well, because I think titles can really confuse us. And I think when it comes to boundaries, when people have a different title in our lives, it's hard to remember boundaries still need to be in place. And when there's the title of a pastor, when there's a title of a boyfriend, when there's a title of a wife, a title of a mother, a title of a daughter, I think it's easy to throw boundaries out the door and go, oh, great, they're a safe space. Oh, great, I don't need to have boundaries with my pastor. I don't need to have boundaries with my spouse. I don't need to have boundaries with my mom. And I want to really bring it back to this verse, because this verse was also super, super helpful for me. It says in Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And it doesn't say guard your heart unless they're a pastor, guard your heart unless they're your husband guard your heart, unless they are your sister or your family or your boyfriend. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And I think titles can confuse us. And I've seen so many people get wrecked and get so deeply hurt by the church, by pastors, by their family members, by other Christians. And a lot of that is because when we know someone's title and we place a title in our lives of who they are to us, it's really easy to forget that we need to guard our hearts. And it's really easy to let our guard down when it comes to them. And not that I want us to be living in fear and feeling like we have to be guarding our heart with every single person. No, but I do think there's a level of healthiness to guarding your heart, no matter the relationship you have with someone. And I think when it comes to pastors, it's really easy not to guard your heart because you trust that what they say is the word of God. But guess what? We're all human. We've all sinned. We've all fallen short. And I think when we put people on this pedestal and we think they're a safe space, or we hear, oh, well, they're a Christian, they're a man of God, I don't need to have the same boundaries I have with them, with other men that I've dated. And I shouldn't have to have these boundaries with them because they love the Lord. And so I know they're going to see me in all of these great, amazing ways. And not that that isn't true, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't guard our hearts. And not in a place of fear, because it doesn't say guard your heart out of a place of fear. It just says guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And guarding your heart in a way that your heart is always a well of life, of love, of joy, of forgiveness, of all of the fruits of the Spirit. And it's going to look different from person to person. But I just wanted to quickly press into the importance of guarding your heart and having boundaries with everyone in your life. Not out of a place of fear, but out of a place of how you can actually experience God's love to the fullest, and you can emulate God's love to the fullest. Because I don't experience God's love to the fullest when I let my guard down and I don't guard my heart when it comes to certain people in my life, and then I end up being mistreated, or I end up hearing things and getting disappointed by what is spoken to me from whatever role that person had in my life. And it's actually so loving to guard your heart with those people, because when I've guarded my heart in my family, when I've guarded my heart with my pastors, when I've guarded my heart with the partners I'm with, it's such a loving environment, because back to that playground analogy, it's safe and it's free. Whereas when I haven't, then I'm so much more susceptible to getting irritated, to being disappointed, to feeling hurt by God because I'm not experiencing His love, or feeling like I'm self-sacrificing in a way that's exhausting me, and it turns me off from wanting to love others. On that note, I want to press into the fruits of the Spirit because I love them. And one that I want to highlight is self-control. It's so cool because, like I said at the start, I thought boundaries were a way of controlling others. And I felt very controlled when I had unhealthy boundaries placed on me. And what's so cool in the Bible is it actually never commands us, allows us, encourages us to control others, but we're called to control ourselves, and we're called to have self-control. And it's a fruit of the Spirit. And I think when it comes to boundaries and knowing who has access to us, on what level they have access to us, on what advice we let them say to us, and advice we're going to take from them, there has to be an element of self-control. And I think it can be really easy to place boundaries, especially in relationships, from a place of controlling them and not yourselves. And I think that can be so common in toxic relationships, or where there's jealousy and where there's mistrust, and can feel like, oh, well, this is a boundary I have because I want to control you so I feel safe. Whereas we're actually not called to do that. We're called to have self-control. And if the way someone's looking at your girlfriend is making you want to control how she looks and how she dresses, that's not self-control, because that's a way of controlling her. If someone's trying to control who you hang out with, how long you hang out with them, where you hang out, what activities you do, that's not self-control. That is control. And I just want to press into this because I think it's so easy in relationships for scripture to be manipulated and for things to be twisted. Really, I think it comes from fear and a sense of feeling like if these things are established and these quote unquote boundaries are implemented, then they're going to get the result that they want and they're going to feel safe. Whereas that's just not true. And even with creating boundaries are going to be broken. Like it's not as though once you have boundaries in your life, they're never going to be crossed and you're always in the safe little box. That's not true. But the point of boundaries isn't to box yourself off. It's that you're building that strength up and you're navigating things in a way and you're learning yourself more and identifying who to trust, how much to trust, what that looks like, so that when boundaries are crossed, when they are broken, you're not completely thrown off. You're able to press forward and you're able to recover quickly. And when you just have boundaries fully out of a place of control of the other person and trying to control this perfect little world for yourself, you're actually not strengthening any muscles. You're weakening yourself because you're not identifying what's actually going on. And your attempt at establishing these boundaries and controlling others is really you prolonging the process of knowing how to control yourself and knowing how to control your own emotions, knowing how to control your own triggers, your own insecurities, your own uncomfortabilities. And I think that can be so destructive. And I definitely know that that's not from the Lord. And God does not allow us to control one another. That's not biblical. That's not in scripture, but self-control is. And a lot of times self-control can look really tough and it's not fun. There's been so many times where so many boundaries are crossed or boundaries aren't established, and I experienced all these horrible things. And really it was because I didn't have the self-control to keep that relationship at more of a distance. And I allowed us to get too close too fast. And I didn't let the Lord lead that friendship. I didn't let the Lord lead that relationship. I chose to enter it and pray that God would make it great. And so a lot of it was self-control of my own part and a lack thereof. And so I think what I love about Jesus is there's always an answer that is directly between you and the Lord, and it doesn't involve other people. And it's so cool because with God, you don't have to wait for other people to make changes and for other people to cooperate in the ways you want them to, or for other people to line everything up so you can live a great life. It really is always about you and him. And it almost always comes down to him changing your heart instead of us changing others. And every single time I've grown in my life and I've experienced tough situations, it's me that needs to change. And maybe it's them. It could be them. But regardless, I'm changed through it. And I love that because you have you and God the rest of your life. You don't have everyone else the rest of your life. And so when you have yourself and you have the Lord, and that is the driving force behind everything, that's what you can improve. That's what you can grow. That's what you can pour into. It's a relationship that is always worth pouring into. It's a relationship that will be with you the rest of your existence. And I love that. So I hope this episode was helpful for you guys. I hope that this just provided a lot of clarity for you and hopefully encouraged you to feel okay and to feel like you're allowed to have boundaries, and knowing when to have boundaries and where to draw them from. And again, never drawing them from a place of fear and control, but always drawing them from a place of how can I love this person better? How can I love myself better? How can I reflect Jesus's love in the best way with boundaries? I love you all, and I cannot wait to talk to you next week.